what I found interesting in my master's program of discovering how dependent non-Indigenous people were upon the Wathaurong people and across Victoria, the other Indigenous peoples as well. This is the first squatter that was in Wathaurong country, and he wrote in his journal, as you can read, that they'd run out of food and they depended entirely on the food that the Wathaurong women, you can see depicted here, that he drew collecting the murnial. And this is to have a huge impact on the colonisation story. I'm spending quite a bit of time on the early colonisation period because it should be recognised that this was the first wave of occupation. This was the first invasion. Gold was the second invasion. That the gold seekers did not come to a pristine environment that was untrammelled by human hands. It had been well and truly trammelled and punished by sheep, as we'll see in a moment. Major Mitchell was one of the first non-Indigenous explorers to not actually visit the Ballarat region, but just to the west of us. And he described the whole plains, the central, what we would now call Victorian Central Highlands Plains, as a sea of gold. And it wasn't the sunshine that he was talking about. Those of you who have come from Melbourne would have passed along a town about halfway between here and Melbourne called Murnial. This little plant was to play a crucial role in the effect that non-Indigenous people had on people across southeastern Australia. I liken it to the Irish potato. My forebears came out during the potato famine, when literally a third of Irish people were starving to death because of the potato crop failed in Ireland. And in a similar way, this was for the Indigenous people in most of southeastern Australia, or most of Australia in fact, this was a staple food. And within 3 years, this food, it looks like very much like a dandelion in all appearances. It's now relatively, not endangered, but relatively rare to find. But it did cover the entire landscape. That was the sea of gold that Mitchell referred to. Was the Murnial was so abundant, and the whole landscape appeared to be in a sea of gold. Just to give you an impression of how abundant it was. Yet 3 years later, in this very district, a Wathaurong person came up to a local squatter near Buninyong, which is a local township for those of you from outside Ballarat, and exclaimed, "Plenty bulgana," meaning plenty cattle, "plenty jumbuck," the word for sheep, "jumbuck," either all Murnial all gone. In 3 years, the staple food of the people in this region had disappeared, which obviously had severe implications. Now these aren't illustrations of Ballarat, in fact they're of Tower Hill. I chose them because they show that in almost exactly the same sort of region. You get some idea of the environmental devastation that was visited upon Indigenous people. These are 15 years apart. And you can see the depletion of the upper story, the mid-story and the lower story vegetation. And again, the effect upon the Aboriginal people, leading relatively traditional lifestyles in this painting, and then pretty much becoming dependent on non-Indigenous foods. To give you an idea of how bad the non-Indigenous people were faring at this point in time, during the squatting period at least, because the squatters in their journals often referred to their diet. This was an important part of how they, what they wrote about in their journals. And one squatter said, for breakfast we have damper and mutton, for lunch we have damper and mutton, and for dinner, for a change, we have mutton and damper. This was the diet that Aboriginal people were forced to adopt as well, when the Murnial largely disappeared from regions across Victoria. One of the responses, and it certainly wasn't the only response, one of the responses was obviously to take the sheep that were feeding on their Murnial, that were feeding on Wathaurong land in this territory. This is rather simplifying it. I was discovering that all too often we as teachers tend to paint this huge canvas, if you like, of almost, we came, we saw, we conquered, end of story. But the more interesting story, the more realistic story is that there were fine brushstrokes literally from one pastoral station, one squatter station to the next. For those of you who are listening to, watching what I thought was fabulous First Australians doco on SBS just recently, I think it was in the first episode where a squatter's descendant was talking about how his family had very close relationships with the Indigenous people in the region of New South Wales, to the point where his great-great-grandfather and mother had learnt the language and sort of catered towards a native title sort of arrangement with the Indigenous people. Still colonisers, mind you. And in a similar sort of way, we see examples of that arrangement here in the Central Highlands. The Learmonth brothers, just as the town of Learmonth is named after, excluded all Aboriginal people. I hope their descendants aren't sitting here. You'll be highly embarrassed from what you hear. Excluded the Aboriginal, the Wathaurong people from being able to even enter onto their traditional lands. And went to the point where their hut keepers had Aboriginal skulls out the front to demonstrate this is what happens when you come onto what's now our land. Conversely, parallel, sort of existing on the same timeline, their very next door neighbour, a gentleman called Bale, not sure if he had a wife or children or not, that's not in the records, that he spoke their language fluently, spoke of how he allowed them into his cabin, employed them, and had in what we would now call a native title agreement. Again, I stress he was still a coloniser, he was still taking over their land, but there was a living together relationship rather than a living apart relationship. So the frontier, as the gold frontier was too, the squatting frontier, was not a monochromatic sort of picture, just black and white. It was quite diverse.